Hello, this is Brant Hunt, discerning what is true, and I am going to share some information on my channels here. I'm going to share with you with the Dr. John Coleman's book, Diplomacy by Deception. I think this needs to be shared with you to know what is really going on in our world, has been going on in our world, and today is the 21st day of January. So we have actually got 1 month of winter away. We got 2 more months till spring. So we're going to talk about the diplomacy by deception here. And the chapter is simply called Israel in Focus. Perhaps more than any other country in the Middle East, with the exception of what is now called Saudi Arabia, diplomacy by deception was seen as its height during the formidable years of the State of Israel. As I have done throughout this book, and made every effort to be absolutely objective in dealing with the background to the formation of Israel, giving the propensity of the majority to regard almost anything said about this country as anti-Semitic. Hold me a second, I'm going to change something real quick. Excuse me. This account of how the State of Israel came into being does not take religious matters into consideration, but is basically purely and simply on political, geographical, geopolitical, and economic factors. It is difficult to arrive at a starting point when dealing with the history of any country, but after almost 15 years of research, I have pinned down October 31st, 1914 as the beginning of events that led to the founding of Israel. The history of one country cannot be separated from that of its neighbors, and they apply, especially when it comes to the historical account of Israel. Lord Horatio Kitchener, fresh from his success in putting an end to the sovereign independency of Boer republics in South Africa, was turned loose on the Middle East by the Committee of 300 acting through the British Foreign Office. The British government had been scheming and plotting against the Turkish Ottoman Empire since 1899, and by 1914 was ready to make its final move to bring down the 400-year-old dynasty. The Committee of 300 plan was to involve the Arabs through false promises and use Arabian forces to do British dirty work. As we saw in the chapter, we showed how Colonel Thomas Lawrence was used for this purpose. The first step in this direction was a meeting between Hussein, the Grand Chief of Mecca, bastion of the Hashemites, and Lord Kitchener. Hussein was offered a guarantee of independence for his assistance against the Turks. Full negotiations began in July of 1915. At these meetings, the British government repeatedly assured Sharif Hussein that Jewish immigration to Palestine would never be allowed, which, as I detailed in earlier chapters, was only the thing that would guarantee Hussein's participation. Even before the negotiation for complete independence from Mecca got underway, emissaries of the British government met secretly with members of the Abdul Aziz and Wahhab families to discuss British cooperation in helping these two families subject the city-states of Arabia. The strategy was to get Hussein and his military forces to help drive out the Turks out of Egypt and Palestine and Jordan and Arabia by promising Hussein and the leaders of Arabian city-states that Jewish immigration into Palestine would not be permitted. The second part of the strategy called for Abdul Aziz and Wahhabi forces, that is armed, trained, and financed by Britain, to bring all independent city-states in Arabia under the control, while the city-states leaders alongside Hussein were busy fighting Britain's war against the Turks. The overall plan proposed by Lord Kitchener was discussed by the British government on July 24, 1914. But it was not until October 24, 1914, that the British government gave its answer. The Arab territories, with certain exception in Syria, in which Great Britain is free to act without detriment to her ally, France, would be respected. On January 30th, 1916, Britain accepted Hussein's proposals, which in essence were that in return for his help, Hussein would be declared king of Hijaz, Hijaz, and would rule the Arab people. On June 27, 1916, Hussein proclaimed the establishment of the Arab state and was proclaimed king of Hijaz on October 29. On November 6, 1916, Britain, France, and Russia recognized Hussein as the head of the Arab people and the king of Hijaz. where the Abdul Aziz and Wahhabi family, disturbed by the contradiction in the terms of their agreement with Great Britain, apparently not for the simple reason that they were informed in advance of these developments and knew that they were no more than a needed deception to be played out on Hussein. The years 1915 and 1917 saw the British government meeting with leaders of the World Zionist Congress to determine how best to implement its long-planned Jewish immigration to Palestine. An agreement was reached to send MI6 agents to Arabia to help train the Abdul Aziz and Wahhabi's armies. Britain, France, and Russia held a secret meeting on April 26, 1916, agreeing that Palestine would be placed under international administration. None of the Arab states, the countries, were informed about this, although British Foreign Office's documents infer that leaders of the World Zionist Congress were notified in advance of the meeting and advised on its purpose. So you see who's doing the bidding of the devil, you see. Previously, in March of 1915, France and Britain had also promised Constantinople to the Russians. In return, Russia agreed that it would recognize the independence of the Arab states. Britain would control Haifa, that is. Now, this is before now you must remember, this is before the Bolshevik Revolution, also Russia. France would get Syria, Russia would get Armenia and Kurdistan. Oil was not yet a factor at this point. What is amazing is that not once were the inhabitants of these lands ever informed. How the governments could trade in lands that did not even belong to them speaks to the tremendous power exercised by the secret societies under the control of the Committee of 300. The perpetual agreement, known as the SYKES, spelled SYKES-PICOT, not PICOT, I guess it's PICOT agreement, was concluded between Britain and France on May 9, 1916. All zones of influence in the Middle East were specifically spelled out, even where Arab states were ostensibly recognized as independent. The means of control here was through secret societies, particularly through a planned Freemason lodge in Salonika, spelled Salonika. Unaware of what had been arranged, MI6 operative Colonel Lawrence, that is Lawrence of Arabia, led the Arab forces of Sharif Hussein to one spectacular victory after another, eventually capturing the key Hejaz rail line, driving the Turks into full retreat. The key element in persuading the Arabs to attack the Turks, both were Islamic nations, was the British statement that the Ottoman Empire had befriended the Jews expelled from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabel in 1492 and had made Constantinople a haven for Jews. This, the British negotiators, that is the MI6 agents, told Hussein, guaranteed that the rulers in the Constantinople will look with favor upon Jewish immigration to Palestine, which was under Turkish control. Affectionately known as Orinas by the Arab soldiers looked up to and idolized, it was impossible for Colonel Lawrence to accept the gross betrayal of Hussein and his army. When it became apparent that the Jews were being allowed in Palestine in large number, Lawrence was subsequently murdered to stop him from disclosing the shenanigans of the British government. They used him. British war officers' records show that Lawrence received personal guarantees from General Edmund Allaby, commander of British forces in the Middle East, that Jewish immigration to Palestine would not be allowed under any circumstances. They used him. They used him. Let us return to the Balfour Declaration, a remarkable document in the sense that it was neither drafted nor signed by the British Prime Minister Alfred Balfour, but by Lord Rothschild as head of the British branch of the World Zionist Federation. Britain promised land in Palestine to Jews that really belonged to the Arabs. In breach of the pledge to Sharif Hussein and solemn promises made to Colonel Lawrence by General Allaby. What is more striking is that although Lord Rothschild was not a member of the British government, his proposals for Palestine were accepted by the League of Nations on April 25th, 1920. That's official British government document. The League of Nations accepted the Balfour Declaration and gave a mandate to Britain to administrate Palestine and Transjordan. The only alternate oration made was that a Jewish national home would not be established in Transjordan, which in any case the Zionists did not want. Once the Turks were defeated by the Arab forces under Lawrence's command, and later the Arabs under Hussein were defeated by the British trained and equipped Abdul Aziz armies, the way was clear for Jewish immigration to Palestine to begin in earnest. Arrangements were confirmed at a conference of Allied prime ministers held at San Remo, Italy on April 18, 1920. No Arab delegates were invited. All done in secret, folks. In May of 1921, serious anti-Jewish rioting broke out in Palestine over the sudden influx of Jewish immigrants and the large number of Jewish settlements springing up. Same thing is happening right now in Europe. Same thing. Your governments all betrayed you, folks. That's what they do if they want to stay in power. Continue. Sir Herbert Samuel, British High Commissioner for Palestine, attempted to appoint a legislative council, but the Arabs would have no part of it unrest until continued from 1921, and dispute at the Wailing Wall in 1929 erupted and rapidly escalated into large-scale attacks on Jews, 50 of whom were killed. A British government report issued in March of 1931 cited the cause of the rising as Arab hatred of Jews and disappointment of the Arabs' hope for independence. The British government then issued a decree restricting Jewish immigration, which led to a Jewish strike that caused wide disruption in Palestine. Folks, let me just make this very clear. Jews are not the children of God. All people are the children of God. Okay? If there is a God. That's a mighty big if. So much. This is treachery. This is what goes on. People forget these things. They don't pass this down to their children. They don't pass this stuff down. They don't tell them what's going on. They don't tell them what's happened in the past. And the same thing is with other countries in the world. Deception by diplomacy by deception. British foreign office documents indicate that in June of 1931, complaints were filed with the League of Nations Commission on Mandates, which blamed the province on an inadequate security force. Although the papers did not indicate who originated the complaints, notations in the margin of these papers pointing to Lord Rothschild. As a result of League of Nations pressure, the British government appointed Sir John Hope Simpson to track and report on the unrest in Palestine. His report, known as the Passfield White Paper, was presented to Parliament in 1930. The White Paper stressed the plight of landless Arabs and their increasing desire to own land. He strongly advocated that Jews be forbidden to acquire more land if any Arabs were landless, and that Jewish immigration be stopped for as long as any Arabs were unemployed. The confidence of the Jews badly shaken, the World Zionist Congress went on to the offensive and forced a debate in Parliament on the Passfield Paper. The London Times in November 1930 said debates in Parliament were heated and acrimonious. After 2 years of intense pressure on the British government, the Zionist World Federation was able to obtain a relaxation of restrictions on the number of Jews allowed into Palestine. In 1933, Sir Alfred Wauchope, I'll spell it for you, Wauchope, British High Commissioner, rejected Arab demands that the sale of Arab land to Jews be declared illegal and that Jewish immigration be halted. By now, talk of war in Europe was in the air, alongside daily reports of Jews being persecuted in Germany. This worked against the Arabs. The Zionists organized large-scale protests and riots against restricted immigration, and newspaper in London reported unfavorably on their activities. This, however, did little to further Palestinian people's cause. It became clear in 1935 why Britain had demanded control of Haifa with the opening of Mosul Haifa oil pipeline. In April 1936, the Arab High Committee united Arab opposition to the Jews in Palestine, and near civil war erupted. The British government responded with more troops and appointed a commissioner to investigate the cause of the unrest. Why are they doing this? They know who's going to do it. There was no unrest before this, folks. The Arabs boycott the commission because the British already knows what the problem is, but hide behind commissioners and do nothing to stop the causes. The Peel Commission took evidence in Palestine in 1936, and just before leaving for London, January 1937, heard from an Arab delegation which had previously boycotted commission meetings. July 18, 1937, the Peel Commission report was made public. A deal devastating blow to Jewish aspirations, flatly stated that Jews and Arabs could not live together and recommended that Palestine be split into 3 states. A. A Jewish state to occupy one-third of the land in it would reside 200,000 Arabs, with the land being held by the Arabs. B. A British mandated territory comprising a strip of land from Jaffa along the railway to Jerusalem. It would include Bethlehem and Jerusalem. C. The remainder of the land to be an Arab state united with Transjordan. The Peel Commission report was adopted by the World Zionist Federation, but it was denounced by the Arab world and several European countries, especially France. The Peel Commission recommendations were adopted by the League of Nations on August 23, 1937. The assassination of High Commissioner Yeller, Yelland, Andrew, on August 2, 1937, was attributed to the Zionists, which the Palestinians and Arabs said was arranged to engender hatred among the British people for the Arabs. By 1937, pitched battles between Jews and Arabs took on the semblance of all-out war. This led to a postponement of the Peel Commission recommendations and the appointment of a new commissioner under Sir John Woodhead. It's important to know that diplomacy by deception tactics of the British government were leading up to one objective: the total abandonment of the Arab cause in Palestine. Let me just say this: when they had these 3 points here, they were already compromising. And A, it says a Jewish state to occupy one-third of the land. They'd already compromised it already. See, they'd already given in, even with the Peel Commission. It's important to know that, let's go back. It's important to know that diplomacy by deception tactics of the British government were leading up to one objective: the total abandonment of the Arab cause in Palestine. Secret MI6 documents of the period were not disclosed even to the British Parliament. They suggested that the Palestinian problem was impossible to solve and gave suggestions for, this is their excuse, and suggested for disassembling to prevent further Arab unrest. When the Arab leaders spoke of the problem as being a Zionist problem, Lord Rothschild issued orders to the British press that the problem was always to be expressed as a Palestinian problem. So we'll see who rules, folks. A horrible massacre of over 20 Jews occurred at Tiberias, and Arab forces took Bethlehem and the old city of Jerusalem, the two cities only being recaptured by British troops with considerable difficulty. British Foreign Office documents, while not clearly expressing opinion, nevertheless seemed to indicate that attacks on the cities and towns and the murder of Jews was the work of agent provocateurs who did not wish to see any agreement reached that would accomplish further Jewish immigration. The Woodhead Commission report, expressing the view that partitioning Palestine was not a practical solution, was released in November of 1938. It called for an immediate conference of Arabs and Jews. Talks commenced in London in February 1939, but a stalemate arose that was not resolved, and the meeting broke up 1 month later without any results being achieved. Then on May 17, 1937, the British government announced a new plan, which provided for an independent Palestinian state by 1949. Would have a treaty relationship with Great Britain. Arabs and Jews were to share in the government in such a way to ensure that the essential interests of each community are safeguarded, the report said. The plan for the Jewish immigration to be halted for 5 years unless the Arabs agreed to let it continue. But in any case, by 1949, 75,000 Jews were to be allowed entry into the country. The aim of the British government was to arrange matters in such a way that Jews would make up about one-third of the population. The transfer of Arab land to Jews was to be prohibited. This plan was approved by the British Parliament, but violently denounced again by the World Zionist Congress and the American Jewish leaders. The Palestinians also rejected the plan, and fighting between Jews and Arabs erupted across the land. But Palestinians took a back seat a few months later, naturally, when Britain declared war on Germany and was promptly backed by the World Zionist Congress. Once Britain declared war on Germany, a flood of Jewish refugees from Europe went to Palestine, and in May 1942, a conference of American Zionists adopted the Biltmore program, which repudiated the modified Woodhead plan, which called for an independent Palestine, demanding its place of Jewish state with a Jewish army and a distinctly Jewish identity. 3 years later, the World Zionist Congress demanded that 1 million Jews be admitted. This is 3 years, folks. The World Zionist Congress demanded that 1 million Jews be admitted to Palestine as refugees from war-torn Europe. Egypt and Syria warned President Truman on October 1945 that war would follow attempts to create a Jewish state in Palestine. July 1946, Zionist pressure was at a fever pitch, culminating in a bombing of King David's Hotel in Jerusalem that took 91 lives. The United Nations reported stating that the bombing was the work of IRGUN terrorists. The Arabs accused the United States and British of arming and training both the Irgun and Haganah as the forerunners to establishing an Israeli army. The British abandoned Palestine in February of 1947 and handed it over to the United Nations, which was their way of admitting that they had betrayed Lawrence and the Arabs and finally reneged on their responsibility towards Palestine. In so doing, they abandoned their own agreement to hold the line until 1949. The UN General Assembly voted to partition Palestine on November 29, 1946. There was to be a Jewish Arab state with Jerusalem under UN trusteeship. The vote was approved by the World Zionist Congress, but rejected by the Arab states in Palestine. The Arab League Council announced in December of 1947 that it would stop the partition of the country by force and began attacking Jewish communities all across Palestine. 1948 saw the open rise to the power of the MI6 trained American armed IRGUN and Haganah counterforce. Terror reigned and hundreds of thousands of Arabs left their lands. In the final act of betrayal and abdication of its responsibilities towards the Arabs, the last of the 30,000 British troops were withdrawn. Think about that, folks. Just think about what that happened. Just think about that. In defiance of UN resolution on May 14, 1948, Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion announced a provisional Jewish government of the State of Israel. They just defied him. They didn't obey him. You know, what do you expect? The United Nations, unwilling or unable to stop Ben-Gurion, led the declaration stand. Well, of course it would, because the United Nations has really no affairs with that. In other words, they don't have any business there in the first place. The British reneged on their own responsibility, but the British should have never even did what they did way back in the early 1900s. It was all compromised, little by little by little by eventually this has happened. So on May 16th, the United States and Russia both recognized the newly formed Ben-Gurion government. So it wasn't, look, within 2 days of the UN resolution, they recognized this government. Your country and Russia did. Brushing aside cries of betrayal emanating from Palestinians, all the Arab nations, and at least 8 European governments. Later in the same month, the Arab League declared war against the newly created State of Israel. The Israeli forces, illegally equipped and armed not by the British but by the U.S. military, supplies from stockpiles for American forces in Europe, gained the upper hand. Who allowed that to happen? Count Pork Bernadotte, a UN mediator, was assassinated by IRGUN, I don't know how to pronounce it, IRGUN, I guess Irgun terrorists on September 17th while trying to bring about a truce. This eventually led to a UN brokered armistice and temporary halt to hostilities. Bernadotte was accused of favoring the Arabs because, although the record shows he tried to be neutral. Israel joined the United Nations in May of 1949. This is amazing, folks. Arab countries protested it to the United Nations and blamed Britain, France, and the United States for helping Israel open a pipeline from the Sea of Galilee to Negev Desert, which made possible the extension and irrigation of Jewish settlements and agriculture at the cost of unilaterally tapping into the waters of the River Jordan at the expense of the Arab population. The Arabs were not consulted about the extension project to make the desert bloom and considered a breach of May 1939 agreement that called for an administration of the country in such a way as to ensure that the interests of each community are safeguarded. On May 9, 1956, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, a member of one of the top 13 families of the American Illuminati, went before Congress to practice its own diplomacy by deception, demanding that the U.S. would not supply Israel with arms because we wanted to avoid a USSR war by proxy. The fact that Israel was already fully armed and equipped by the U.S. was not brought out, never talked about it. What the Dallas Declaration of Confidence provision provided, a reason for the USSR to halt arms supplies to the Arab nations on the basis of a U.S. position on the neutrality. Another deception here, folks. At that point, there was a glaring imbalance of arms in favor of Israel. Another point worth noting in the game of deception was that in spite of a allergic friendship with the Arab countries in response to a U.S. initiative in 1956, the Soviet Union signed a secret deal which called for stepping up oil supplies to Israel, fearing that the Arab oil embargo might hurt Israel's defense capacities. Dulles, in another change of face, told members of Congress to get around restrictions by offering aid to any Middle Eastern nation desiring it. On March 9, 1957, a joint congressional resolution empowered the president to use up to $200 million for economic and military assistance to any Middle Eastern nation desiring it. They're dangling the rabbit's foot here. Come on. According to the Eisenhower Doctrine, this was supposed to assure vital U.S. interests in the integrity of the independence of all Middle Eastern countries. Really? President Eisenhower embarked on what was billed as a goodwill tour in December 1959, which took in several Arab countries, including Tunisia and Morocco. Both of these Arab countries later tried to tone down Arab resistance to Israel efforts, which, however, were only partially successful, as was Eisenhower's tour. Syria, in particular, condemned the tour as an attempt to disguise the outright support of Israel by the United States. In the next 10 years, the armed buildup of both the Arabs and the Israelis continued to grow until war broke out again. Israeli forces took Jerusalem and refused to return the city to UN control in spite of several Security Council resolutions calling upon the government of Israel to comply. In a transparent move on June 10, 1967, the Soviet Union announced it was breaking off diplomatic relations with Israel, although it did not cancel a 1956 agreement made which stepped up oil supplies to Israel. As the two main French newspapers pointed out, had the USS been genuine in its opposition to Israel, it could have vetoed Israel's membership in the United Nations, but it did not. By breaking off diplomatic relations with Israel, the Soviets opened the way for the U.S. to supply Israel with 50 F-4 Phantom jet fighters. Stirring the pot. This so angered President Charles de Gaulle, which is of France, that he signed a decree forbidding any further financial military assistance to Israel by France. This decree was rigidly enforced for about 2 years. The UN Security Council met on July 3, 1969, and censured in the strongest terms Israel's continued occupation of Jerusalem and deplored Israel's failure to respect previous resolutions, which demanded that Israel withdraw from the city. Yeah, be a good little boy. Please don't do that again. See, this is all bullshit games here, folks. According to a former General Assembly member from Pakistan, the Israeli delegation was not at all perturbed, having met earlier that day with the U.S. ambassador to the UN, who gave the Israeli delegates absolute assurance that the resolutions had no teeth. They're playing games, folks, and that any active attempt to punish Israel will be blocked by the United States and the Security Council. But when the Security Council met, the United States joined in the condemnation of Israel. Of such stuff is diplomacy by deception made. Playing games. In closing this chapter, we see fitting to give a summary of the diplomatic history of Britain towards its Arab ally, Sheikh Hussein of Mecca. In August of 1920, the Saud bin Abdul Aziz conquered and annexed Asir, A-S-I-R. On November 2nd, 1921, Ibn Saud captured Hati, H-A-L-I, into the ancient dynasty of the Rashids, R-A-H-I-D-S. So you see what's happening here. Everything's happening for a reason. These were independent states, city-states, so to speak. July of 1922, the Saud ran Joff and entered the ancient Shalom dynasty, S-H-L-A-N dynasty. On August 24th, 1924, the Wahhabis and the Ibn Saud attacked Taif, T-A-I-F, in the Hajj and overrun it on September 5th. On October 13, 1924, Ibn Saud took Mecca. Shahrazad and his son Ali were forced to flee. This is how Saudi Arabia usurped the holy city, an act which remains to this day deeply resented by millions of Muslims in Iran, Iraq, and elsewhere. They didn't have any business doing it, folks. Without British help, Hassan would not have been able to subdue Mecca. The British oligarchy structure had been expressed hatred of the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad, and no doubt took great satisfaction in Salti's victory. Between January and June of 1925, the Wahhabis laid siege to the city-state of Jeddah, J-I-D-D-A-H. On December 5th, 1925, Medina surrendered to Ibn Saud, and on December 19th, Shahrazad, son of Suzanne, was forced to abdicate. On January 8, 1926, none of this is taught about, folks, in history. None of it. I never even heard of this. The Saud was the proclaimed king of Hejaz and Sultan of Najd. On May 20th, 1927, the Abdul Aziz and Wahhabi families represented by Azan signed a treaty with Great Britain, which recognized the complete independence of all territories held by the two families and allowed them to become known as Saudi Arabia. Without the help of the Arab nation states under Hussein and without the conquest of Arabian city-states by the Wahhabi and the Abdul Aziz families, the Turks would not have been driven out of Egypt and Palestine, and Jewish immigration into that country would have been impossible or strictly curtailed. And President Hafez Assad of Syria said in 1973, the British planned a Zionist dagger in the heart of all the nations of the Arabian nations. It's said by friends of the late Colonel Lawrence that his ghost walks the corridors of Whitehall, unable to find peace because of the matter which diplomacy by deception succeeded in undercutting his firm promise to the Arab armies of Hussein, and because of his culpability in accepting Alibi and Whitehall's false promises that Jewish immigration to Palestine would not be permitted. So that's the interest there. It's important that you understand, again, what has happened in history and how it's been done. In this book by Dr. John Coleman, the diplomacy by deception and fooling certain countries to fight against other countries and then using them and then throwing them out to the wind. That is my conclusion tonight for the program. I hope that you enjoyed it. Again, it's important that you understand history and what has happened. They don't talk to you about these things and how this happened. So at this point, I appreciate you being here. I hope that you glean some wisdom about this and understanding. Again, this is Diplomacy by Deception. My name is Brant Hunt. And this is my channel, Discerning What is True. And you have a good night. You take care.